Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tax Day, April 15th, 2026. Do people even think about this as Tax Day? It was once one of the biggest days of the year. Like I remember driving to the post office before midnight. There would be a huge traffic jam around the central post office in Washington, D.C., so that everybody could get their tax form in stamped with the thing before 11:59 p.m. I get the sense that because most people file electronically now, or at least enough people file electronically, that this isn't even an issue anymore. But it was such a big day, and here it is. It's tax day again today, but maybe this is just like a relic of a previous hysterical time. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, here on Tax Day with executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John. I just wanted to say, I heard recently that there are still more car accidents on tax day.
Okay.
So people must be
because
thinking
people
about
are driving fast to get to the post office?
or something like that, yeah. Or fiddling with their phones to make the payments or something.
Right, okay. And of course, Washington Free Beacon editor Eliana Johnson. Hi, Eliana.
Hi, John.
Tax day, not a big day, not a big thing?
You know, I dread it so much that I get it taken care of early.
Right.
Well,
that's
I
the other
start
thing,
anticipating this in like January.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, you're like a solid citizen.
It has nothing to do with my solid citizenry and everything to do with my loathing for the federal government and all of its requirements.
Well, this was a thing where, like, Grover Norquist, who ran Americans for Tax Reform, the run-up to April 15th in the 1980s was always do you realize what you're about to do when you file you realize that he would then pick a day where your debt to the government was paid, like how much your money ran through the federal government was paid off. It was like, July 30th or something like that. Like, these dates used to have real political valence. Do they for you, social commentary columnist Christine Rosen?
Well, as you saw, I thought IRS and I immediately ran. No.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, John. No, I'm like Eliana. I hate taxes. I have to pay estimated payments every quarter, so I'm constantly in touch with the federal government.
We do that,
and the district government. Yeah. But I will say this morning, I'm an early riser. I was up early walking my dog, and I bumped into a neighbor. It was such a wonderful analog moment, who was sort of mall walking and very speedily walking to the mail drop box around our corner so that he could mail his tax payment in an envelope with a stamp and get it stamped for today. So there are still people doing it old school, which I appreciate.
Okay, there we go. We're rocking it. So many things that used to matter that don't matter, sort of dates that used to have a kind of, that weren't not just holiday dates, but dates that used to matter. I just don't know if they've been replaced, because now a lot of dating of things that have like cultural significance are surprises, right? It's like, oh my God, Taylor Swift just is dropping her album in 16 hours. Nobody even knew that she was doing an album in 16 hours. Or
also more
like
car
that.
accidents on days that big albums come out. It's true.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, this isn't like one of those stats about how men beat their wives more on Super Bowl Sunday than they do on other days of the. Remember that controversy?
Vaguely.
In the 90s, there was a whole thing about how domestic violence.
Yes, the awesome
spikes
Christina
on Super
Summers
Bowl Sunday.
debunked that stat many times.
Oh, that's
over the
right.
years.
That's right. That's right.
She
That's
was-
right. Yeah, yeah. I think it is true that there was this huge increase. There was this point at which there was this huge increase in emergency room admissions on Thanksgiving morning, because people were dropping their turkeys into vats of boiling oil to make a fried turkey, and that the turkey would then explode and the oil would, and that was a real thing until people realized that you can't just drop a turkey into a giant multi-quart, boiling oil tin. Okay, so there are things like that, but we don't know what they are anymore. I mean, I don't know what they are anymore. We're temporizing a little bit because I don't know what to talk about. Like, there's all sorts of things to talk about. We could talk about how historic face-to-face meeting between Israel's ambassador Yechiel Leiter and the Lebanese ambassador, convened by Marco Rubio yesterday. A huge diplomatic development that likely will not bear that much fruit if the purpose is to get to some kind of an agreement between Israel and Lebanon that would lead to a ceasefire, because the only ceasefire to be had in Lebanon has to do with disarming Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government does not have the power to take the arms away from Hezbollah, and Israel doesn't have the power to take the arms away from Hezbollah. It can only sort of bomb Hezbollah into submission. But still, a very big moment at which the Lebanese government is expressing its desire to be thought of as separate from Hezbollah, right? So that's and that tectonic plates are shifting in the Middle East to make that happen. Okay, here's something that we can talk about. None of us is an economist, so we stipulate that. But an important development yesterday was that the International Monetary Fund announced that due to the war, there was likely to be a recession this year in 2026. And I don't, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. I don't know. Economy is very complicated. There's no way that this was not released by the IMF as a political act to try to interfere with the ongoing proceedings in the Middle East that America and Israel are engaged in. That's my take. Is there's no such thing as economics without politics. There's no such thing as an international NGO acting and making major statements that are not intended to affect the nature of the international conversation. Do you guys agree with me that this is hanky-panky?
I mean, it might be, but it's also the case that there's some very unusual and weird things happening, at least domestically, with the economy. I mean, inflation is the highest it's been in 3 years, I think. But the stock market did well yesterday, and there seems to be a willingness on the part of the consumer to continue to borrow and spend, which wouldn't be happening if there were more fears. Now, long term, I think prices will continue to rise as long as the Strait is closed. We've talked about some of the trickle-down effects of the war, but this economy has been very difficult to predict, both about jobs, about inflation, and I think that just continues. And it's quite volatile, which is great for traders, not so great if you're trying to make long-term plans. But I find that the usual signals, the usual predictions made by economists have not held up more than a few days each cycle. And whatever the IMF is wading into, I would assume is mischief making, as you say, John. But it's also kind of difficult to see where we're headed. I mean, a lot of people's retirement portfolios have taken a hit, but we're still weirdly confident in a way that I think a lot of us, including myself, wouldn't have predicted even a month ago.
Yeah, I've come to take predictions like that, and even the release of numbers with a grain of salt, owing to the constant dramatic revisions. So, yeah, but I agree. I certainly wouldn't put it past the IMF to be doing this, to tinker with and as a sort of comment on American and Israeli policy.
Britain's finance minister, Rachel Reeves, came out yesterday evening or something like that and went absolutely ballistic about how stupid this war is and how we had no goals that were achievable or understandable, and the amount of international uncertainty that has been entered into in this is just absolutely insupportable. A very, very harsh statement, from an ally. Obviously, Trump has, broken the rules on how we talk about allies, but she's not the prime minister. She's the, I don't know, I guess she's the chancellor of the exchequer. Is that is she? If she's the finance minister? I don't know. Anyway, she's speaking for the world of sort of liberal public opinion about how terrible this all is. And it gets back to this question of Trump's so terrible the way he treats NATO and our allies, and it's so awful and everything like that. And fine, I sort of agree that Trump has made this way worse that it needs to be. But like, if she's so concerned about the international economy and what's going on with the oil, we are back to, why aren't you sending some ships to involve yourself in this process, which looks like we're closing the Strait of Hormuz, but by which we are actually opening the Strait of Hormuz by blockading the Strait of Hormuz. I know it's a bit of a conundrum, but like, to stand on the sidelines and yell at us for being so feckless when you are refusing to play a role. Oh, and of course, not just that, but I think Starmer and a couple of other have announced that once it's all over, once the shooting is over, they are going to involve themselves in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, but not with us. They're going to do it themselves, whatever on earth that means. So we got the IMF, we've got the British finance minister, we've got kind of world opinion yammering about how terrible all of this is, and I think in a weird way, it makes it easier for Trump to completely ignore all of it, because it doesn't seem to be coming from a place of honest, impersonal, non-ideological analysis, because there probably can be no such thing.
Well, Trump has said this time round, from the start, when reporters have approached him with the unpopularity of the war based on polls and things, Trump has not done his usual thing, which is to say, I don't believe the polls. Believe me, people love it. They're lying. You're lying. The polls are lying. He said, I don't care if it's popular. I don't care if people like it. I have to do the right thing. So I think from the start, he has decided to tune out all the critics this time round. I mean, this is his sort of, this is his big shot.
We know that when this was discussed internally, we were told in that New York Times report that his communications people, who the president really trusts, Stephen Chung has been with Trump for a long, long time, said waging this war goes against the grain of everything you've campaigned against, which is not starting new wars, particularly in the Middle East. But if you do it, I'll support you. And so I think Gabe is right that Trump went into this knowing that there would be loud voices on the right who opposed it. But I also think he understands that what he said about, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and still have the support of his base. That's also proved true. The people who oppose it are the loud voice, the people in Podcastistan, loud voices on the MAGA right, and independent voters who are already disapproving of the job the president is doing for a host of other reasons. But he was warned, and he went into it with eyes wide open.
And those, the NATO alliance has been an interesting sort of like a hockey puck in this administration. Trump uses it rhetorically to criticize European allies. I actually don't think he'll totally withdraw. I think that would create more trouble than it's worth for him. But he's made it entirely transactional. So Germany and some of these other countries now are saying, okay, what does NATO look like, a European NATO, without the U.S.? Because we can no longer rely on the U.S. as a consistent ally. What will we do for our own defense? But all of that is kind of a sideshow. I mean, the question I have is how this war, once it all shakes out, is going to change our own understanding of alliances. If we're not going to ally with European countries, is it going to be India? Is it going to be certain countries in Europe, like Poland, others that are more in line with what the Trump administration wants to see happen globally? I do worry long term about some of the decline of trust in the United States as a backer of freedom and democracy and all the things we tend to care about. But we're in a transactional age now. The shift, the sort of global rules-based order doesn't exist anymore. We helped blow it up, but it was being destroyed from within for a very long time. So I think those long-term questions, particularly with regard to China and Russia, will continue, long past Trump's second term.
One of the reasons that Trump was not injured from what we can tell, really, or damaged, or his candidacy derailed by his skepticism about NATO beginning in 2015, is that NATO was the answer to questions that have been settled. That does not mean that NATO is not a valuable alliance now. But NATO was a way of knitting the West together after two world wars in which elements of the West fought against each other. So what do you do when Germany and France and Britain and the Low Countries and what are, end up literally, like killing millions of each other in a war in 2014, and then one 1914, and then one 30 years later? What do? Well, you settle matters, and then you try to create common conditions under which the belligerencies of the previous millennium are changed, in part because there was this new or different adversary that was a terrible threat that overwhelmed any questions of the cultural differences between Britain and France. And though France, of course, was a weird semi-not member of NATO, but Britain, France, Germany, everybody who was in NATO, right? So that was the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union, so we needed to stand resolutely together, an attack on one, an attack on all, which was a way of extending the mutual assured destruction theory outside of the continental United States into Europe to keep the Soviets, hemmed in. And then the Soviet Union ended. And so NATO's purpose had to undergo a shift. And so NATO became a democratic alliance, even though it was effectively one anyway, although Turkey was in it, so it wasn't that democratic. But it had to be. Then the idea was, well, let's bring as many people into NATO as possible. Let's bring Eastern Europe into NATO. Let's bring the former Eastern Europe into NATO. Let's bring the Baltic states into NATO. Let's make it bigger, and then it becomes essentially an alliance of the democracies outside of the Far East. And that's fine, and it's a useful thing for us to have. But, if the purpose was to make the West a place in which these countries that had bedeviled the planet for a millennium would stop going to war with each other, for generations, it kind of worked, right? And then now Trump viewed it, or started to view it, as a handcuff on American freedom of action, and he did not want that anymore.
I will add to that. Yeah. He says he doesn't want it anymore, and he says they weren't fulfilling their obligations, but then he did try, after the war began, to call on them to assist, and that they're not going to do that. But he didn't try to call the alliance into the effort before the war started, understandably. But he has actually, he's been rather inconsistent about appealing to help from NATO since the conflict began.
Well, okay, I really don't like the way he's handled NATO. I want to make this clear. I'm not defending his handling of NATO, but when he calls on them to assist in a struggle by Israel and the United States against the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and a country that had just murdered 30,000 of its own citizens, and was looking to develop a nuclear weapon, and nuclear nonproliferation is one of the hallmarks of the very concept or idea behind NATO. And they're like, well, you were mean on Greenland, so we're not gonna help you. He kind of makes the case for its obsolescence. In other words, it shouldn't matter that he's a shit toward NATO, or it shouldn't matter that he wants Greenland and Denmark got all upset. This is something bigger than that. This was the two democratic states going after a totalitarian country that has done nothing but sow discord, dissension, and created instability in a very important region on Earth. And they should be able to swallow their discomfort and dislike of him in pursuit of larger geopolitical aims.
But the reason, to play devil's advocate for those countries, his unpredictability is a risk to them, Because if they help him now, that is no guarantee that when they call on the United States for help, that the United States under Trump will help them. And I think that's where that was the underlying tension of the Greenland
But
stuff.
his line is, again, I don't want to keep stipulate, but I think that he's mishandled NATO. Don't get me wrong. But his line is, oh, we don't help you. We help you every single day. We pay 10 times the amount for the defense of the West than you do. So I don't know what you're saying. You want to call, we're not going to help you. For 80 years, we've supported your welfare states. So don't come to me and say I'm not helping you. Even now, even right now, with our defense budget and how we spend our defense budget and all of that, you guys are off the hook for doing things that, were we not around and had this deal not been struck, you would have twice or 3 times the amount of spending you would have had to do over the past half century just to keep yourself safe from the kind of depredations that, say, Ukraine is now suffering from Russia. So I don't even think that's a viable argument. I mean, it's a viable argument if you don't want to do it in the first place. And you don't want to actually play a major role on the world stage, except when you want to open a mouth and whine about how the war wasn't planned properly. Rachel Reeves living in Britain, which is collapsing under its own economic, under dreadful economic conditions that vastly outweigh whatever difficulties we have here in the United States in 2026.
Look, I believe in NATO. I'm a supporter of NATO. I think we should continue the alliance at the very least. But, John, when you talk about it being an alliance of democracies, yes, these European countries are absolutely still democracies. But the truth is they have, over the decades, increased the size of parts of their populations that are absolutely at war with democracy, that do not believe in it, that believe in Iran's cause over the U.S.'s, certainly over Israel's. And you cannot discount the degree to which these European leaders are responding to those Europeans.
That's a very important point. If Israel were not involved in this war, it would obviously be vastly easier in terms of domestic politics in these countries for them to involve themselves in the war. And that's particularly true of Great Britain, where the base of the Labour Party now is so heavily, which is in free fall, having won this enormous election 2 years ago or whenever it was, incredibly dependent on the Muslim vote now. I mean, we published a piece the week after by Stephen Pollard, the week after Starmer won his overwhelming victory. And Pollard predicted where we are now. He said, this is the high watermark for Labor, winning 400 seats or whatever it was. This is as good as it's ever going to get. And it's going to start to collapse right now, because that's the nature of British politics. People are going to go back to their old, or even if there's a split on the right between the rising Reform Party and the Tories, Labor's support is the highest that it will ever be on the day after Election Day. And as it declines, they're going to have to ballast, start making levies dam up their support before it leaches away. And that's going to be the Muslims first. And the Muslims first means turning on Israel, not enforcing laws very stringently on attacks on Jews in London and Manchester and elsewhere, doing very little to make the case that this behavior is insupportable. Now, remember, those Muslims, the British Muslims, are not overwhelmingly Arab, right? They're South Asian. They're not. It's a different thing from this Syrian influx that came into Germany and France and elsewhere. But this is a very important point that, and by the way, you can even go back in time and say it was an important point back in 1990, 1991. Built this enormous alliance to fight the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, right? I think it was 53 nations. And in fact, they helped pay for it. And they helped pay for it such that, according to some calculations, we actually made money on the war from the subventions from the other countries. Like, they paid us enough that we spent, 100 billion and we got 104 billion back. And so we, in fact, did not even lose money fighting the war, something like that. But one of the preconditions for that was very clear, as it turned out, was no Israeli involvement. And not only were the Israelis not to be involved, even though they were a regional power and with intelligence on Iraq and all of that, but if they were hit by Saddam Hussein, they were not allowed to respond, because any intervention by Israel, even in self-defense, was going to call the nature of the alliance to get Saddam out of Kuwait into question and create bad political conditions for America in that alliance. So even there, and that was a much larger alliance than merely NATO, but NATO was, of course, the most important player in it. Even there, the factor of Israel before the Muslim in-migration into Europe was what it has since become. This has always been a problem. And if America is going to stand with Israel, hence now and henceforth, and maybe it's not, we don't know, the polling here is pretty terrible, we're on a collision course with NATO unless we change so many facts on the ground by defeating Iran and doing various other things that the geopolitics of the Middle East shifts and alters, and a lot of this quiets down. But that is a key element of this, even though that's not what Trump is screaming about. But so I'm just saying the IMF is coming in against the war. British Foreign Minister, Finance Minister is coming in against the war, and they're coming in against the war. And now,
Don't forget the
gingerly,
Pope.
well, gingerly we can put our toe in the water on the Pope, because we are who we are, and I don't want to get into, as we would say, a broigus with the Pope or with our Catholic listeners.
No, guy from Chicago versus guy from Queens. It's a tough fight, these two.
Fight. Very, very, very tough fight. Villanova against Penn, two colleges in Pennsylvania. It's very grim, very grim. Okay, but there is something interesting about what's going on with the Pope that is also a change that has to do with the kind of changes that Trump has wrought, not that the Pope has wrought. And that is to say that 66 years ago, John F. Kennedy ran for president. He was the second Catholic to be the nominee of a major political party. And enormous efforts were made to stimulate quietly anti-Catholic sentiment against Kennedy. And Kennedy and the Kennedy people went at this directly by saying, I'm not a vassal of the Pope. Like, I don't work for the Pope. I am not, the Pope is the spiritual leader of my faith, but, and the Pope and the Catholic Church in the United States said, we don't involve ourselves in American politics. You can vote for John F. Kennedy with an understanding that we don't involve ourselves in American politics, which of course is ridiculous. Archbishops in cities played enormous political roles behind the scenes and in states throughout the 20th century. They had very large organizing capacities and all that. But nonetheless, they said, we don't play a role. And we don't play a role, and we are here for the spiritual lives of our people and all of that. Politics then increasingly involved cultural matters, particularly abortion, in which Catholics, and nuclear matters, nuclear freezes, death penalty, things that the Catholic Church did have strong views on that it would express over time. But a personal political struggle between the heir of St. Peter and the elected president of the United States is a radically new development in world politics.
We need to note that it's Trump who picked this fight. Previous popes have made general statements against war and for peace, and the kinds of things that this pope has said are not at all out of the realm of what popes say. The difference is that we have a president who is treating the pope like the world's greatest influencer, and so he's going to take him on and show him that he has more influence. And the fact that JD Vance is also kind
in
of
fact the world's original influencer.
I mean, that's great.
No one's a bigger influencer in the world. Yes.
I think this is a huge error on the part of the Trump administration to try to pick a fight in this way. It's not. There's no reason for it. It shows a lot of disrespect of what the Pope's role is on the globe and to Catholics around the world. And it's just a waste of time and energy. It is certainly putting J.D. Vance in a very difficult position where he's defending the president against the Pope.
And poor J.D. Vance.
No, but I just think it's a fight and a way of staging a fight that Trump picked, and I think it was an error in judgment on his part.
Okay, so again, I do not want to wade into Catholic theology and the role the Pope plays in the ongoing life of our nation or in the practical politics of the world. But and I don't want to defend J.D. Vance, who I think we're going to talk about him a little bit in a minute. But he did say, the Pope said like something very close to "we're always against war."
John.
And that, I'm sorry, a Pope doesn't get to say after 2,000 years that popes are always against war, because it's not, because popes aren't always against war. And the one war that we know that the Pope, I'm sorry, again, but like the one war that the Pope refused to involve himself in, that where he could have made a difference, was the most important war in the history of Europe, right? Which was World War II, where the papacy may have done things behind the scenes or not, depending on how you want to look at it. I am not a believer that the Pope did anything but behave shamefully in World War II. But nonetheless, there are arguments that say that he did a lot of stuff quietly, but he certainly did nothing publicly, and didn't and sat there while this was going on. And so there's a little bit of moral, I would say. So, but it's simply not true. Just war theory exists as a Catholic tradition. That's not a Jewish tradition. We don't have a just war theory. Protestantism doesn't have a centralized just war theory. Catholicism has a just war theory. Therefore, if you have a just war theory, war can be just by definition. And Pope Leo seemed almost to say that that was not the case. Or at least a couple of the archbishops speaking for him on 60 Minutes seemed to suggest that that was not the case, that the default position of the church was pacifistic. And I just don't think that history tells us that that is true. That's all I'm saying. Whether Trump shouldn't have picked this fight, it's stupid, it's pointless, and it's damaging, and we have a lot of other troubles. But I mean, I don't think the Pope and his people are blameless here. They have decided to put themselves in this conversation rather than remove themselves. And again, I'm sorry, but Israel starts to play a role here too, because if they gave one crap about what happened, what Hamas did to the Jews after October 7th, and if they cared at all about religious freedom for Catholics in the Middle East, they would be waving the Israeli flag and saying, you go and win everywhere, because when you win everywhere and take over the entire Middle East, Catholicism will be practicable. You will be able to practice Catholicism again, where in most of these countries, with the exception of Lebanon, you cannot, or in any safe way, you can't. But their kind of weird institutionalized anti-Zionism will not allow them to say that. And here I did wade fully into the waters that I didn't want to wade into. And
look, I mean, remember Pope Francis, a year after October 7th, did declare that, a day of prayer and called for the return of the hostages. And so you're right that the papacy has waded into contemporary conflicts in certain ways. I would just caution that what some archbishops are saying on 60 Minutes isn't necessarily what the Pope himself either approved or allowed. I mean, maybe it did. Like the whole way, the chain of command in the Vatican is quite different from the way we think of sort of political arguments, even about war. So I just the history of the papacy, you're right, and warfare is very complicated. There have been decades of very, very much pacifistic outlook about global events, and others where there's a more interventionist tone. Certainly, if you start talking about economic and labor issues, papacies in the past, right up to Pope Francis, have waded in on those in a way that is quite different from some of our own views about free markets and such. But I just felt like this was a ridiculous fight to pick for Trump. And so it just didn't make sense to me that he couldn't take a little gentle criticism of a war from the papacy, even that wasn't specifically named. It just showed me his thin skin in a way that
ignored
didn't.
it. Yeah, he could have ignored it. But of course, he ignores nothing. That's Trump's policy is you attack me, I attack you. I attack you if you're Pope Leo. I attack you if you're Riley Gaines. I attack you if you're Corinne Brown with the hat in Florida in 2017. I'll attack you if you're like an athlete who said something on an interview on SportsCenter when I was watching it one night. It doesn't matter. And so in that sense, he's wildly egalitarian and sees no power differential between he punches down, he punches up.
When people would say in 2016, 2017, whatever, that he is misogynist and he is terrible to women, it was like, this guy is an equal opportunity offender. He will attack anybody who attacks him, and he will use whatever material he has at hand to attack them with. And it's the same with, he's an anti-Semite, he's a this, he's a that. No, Trump likes people who doesn't like him, and he doesn't like people who don't like him. It's really not that complicated.
Okay, can we talk about Vance? Because Vance spoke yesterday at the Turning Point USA Summit. And I think he said a couple of interesting things, some of them about this question of the Pope's role in politics. But he did some other stuff Abe was, I think, particularly struck by. I mean, he said something, his tone and his language and the things that he said, it's interesting because he's got a very sober or kind of like even demeanor that were his rhetoric and his general approach to things, if it matched the tone, one would view him as an uncommonly gifted communicator, not quite at Rubio's level of weirdly uncommon gifted communicators, but his mannerism is very effective, I think. But then he says things that are almost catastrophic while he's doing them. And so one of them was about the Pope. The first thing was somebody started to heckle him about how supporting genocide in Gaza. And his answer was that, before we came into power, Gaza was a humanitarian catastrophe, and we solved it. And we solved it, so stop heckling me. If you care about it, you should like us. Well, okay, Gaza was a humanitarian catastrophe because Hamas started a war on October 7th. He didn't not say that. But the clear implication was that sort of the Biden administration combined with Israeli belligerence somehow led to a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that Trump fixed. Now, if it's true, I could make the case that Trump fixed it by letting Israel loose and bringing the war to a close. But that, I don't think, was what he was trying to convey. He was trying to convey that everybody was a bad guy until we came along and then we fixed it. So if that's what he was trying to say, the hell with him. That's number one. Number two was what he said about the Pope, where he said the Pope needs to be careful about weighing into politics. And I don't think that J.D. Vance has the standing, even as the elected vice president of the United States, to tell the Pope how he should behave. Like, first of all, he just converted. So maybe he should have a little, it'd be like me
Well, we are
killing.
sitting here, John. We're not even Catholics, and we're sounding off about the Pope. So
I know, but I don't subscribe to the idea that the Pope is the rock of a church. So I can criticize him fine. He's the one who pledged his fealty
I
to
mean,
the theology that
well,
says the
I
Pope is
happen
the
to
rock of the
agree
church.
with him, so I guess I'm more sympathetic.
Okay, but should he? Everybody should be careful about wading into politics so that you don't say something stupid if you're an important and powerful person. That sort of goes without saying. But I'm only bringing this up to say that it's like he's saying, as a Catholic of 3 minutes standing, I really think the Pope ought to be careful. Okay, all right, like if a convert to Judaism started arguing with Sully Soloveitchik on the finer points of Jewish theology, I would generally think that was probably something that he should not do. Not that Sully Soloveitchik, our Jewish commentary columnist, is the Pope of Judaism. I'm just saying he's pretty learned, and you might want to close your mouth.
I don't have much to say about what Vance said regarding the Pope, to be honest. I'm
right,
more.
But you have others. You have other things.
Well, I'm just more struck by it. It was just a stunning example of this incredibly difficult situation that Vance has put himself in, where he is stuck between Trump and Trump's pro-Israel policies and the war in Iran, and this crowd, the Podcastistan crowd, that he is still trying to sort of maneuver a path between the two and not turn off the anti-war, anti-Trump, anti-Israel youth on the right. And so he said, for example, I know a lot of you out there don't approve of our Iran policy or our Middle East policy. I would urge you not to sever your relationship with us based on this one policy. In fact, the thing to do is speak up, get more involved if you dissent on a policy, not to sort of cut us loose. It's the kind.
He also said, we've done immigration, we've brought
Right.
gas prices down,
Right.
and if you agree with someone on 4 out of 5 things, you stick with that person. And I think what was striking about that to both of us, Abe, was he didn't make the case for it. He sort of conceded that, yeah, we did something bad here, but on 4 out of 5 of your issues, we're good, which is, was striking.
And what's the fifth issue?
The fifth
really?
issue is the most
Jews.
important anyway, but go ahead.
The fifth issue
Go
is
ahead.
Jews.
Repeat that. Jews.
Well, in that,
Yes.
he is someone who's very careful about the words he uses. He's the opposite of Trump in that regard. And I think both the way he scolded and warned the Pope, which, as you say, John, that's definitely above his pay grade. He should not be doing that even as a Catholic. That was a particular choice, and Abe's absolutely right about the way he worded this message to younger MAGA voters. And that is a strategic choice, and it's one that he continues to clearly walk that very fine line within the administration about, Trump. Look, he's the guy who just went to try to negotiate with Iran in Pakistan. He's been put forward as the face of quite a few of these choices that he personally seems to oppose. I don't think he can walk that line very much longer. Not if he is actually actively courting that base, because they are just way on the other side of that line. But he chooses his words very strategically. In that way, it's worth parsing exactly how he phrases some of these claims.
He's the mirror image of Kamala and Biden when they started trying not to turn off the pro-Hamas crowd.
Well,
Explain. Just
When Kamala would get heckled, as Vance did last night over the war in Gaza, she would say whatever, she would object in some way, and Biden did this too. She'd say, "You have a point. these people have a point. And, the change in rhetoric over time of the Biden administration to appease the growing pro-Hamas crowd. So you have Vance last night saying, get more involved if you don't like our policy. He was asked who his favorite influencer is. He said Theo Von.
Which podcast should the young people listen to?
Which podcast should the young people
recommend to them?
Theo Von, who goes on about Israeli genocide and revisionist history and all the rest of it. Who J.D. Vance said has a good heart, and J.D. Vance loves him. So he's trying to, without saying, yes, you're right about the horrors of Israel and the Jews. He's trying to say, no, I like all the same people as you. I'm with you.
I think what comes, what Biden and particularly Harris, what we saw in the last, in her 107 days of campaigning was she operated from, and Schumer, during the 4 years of Biden, and Pelosi too, when that resolution to condemn Ilhan Omar came to the House floor and they changed it to condemn all forms of discrimination rather than anti-Semitism in particular. They operated from a place of fear and trepidation toward the extremists in their party who have now marched in and essentially taken over the party to the point that we see, mainstream Democratic candidates campaigning with Hassan Piker, who, said we deserve 9/11 and this, that, and the other. And they were cowed by them. And when the American people saw that on the campaign trail, they didn't like it. And they thought, these people are weird. Those views are weird. They're too far out there. And I think Abe is right that there's a danger of that happening on the right because the influencer class, Candace Owens and Tucker and all the rest, they're not normal. They're not representative of, the average person.
Look, I mean, it's even the ironies here to combine both what Abe and Eliana just said are that I think it's pretty fair to say that while Biden would not be my idea of the Zionist leader any Zionist would ever have wanted, that he certainly bore no relation or similarity to Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush and the Squad and all of that. He was a glad hander of the old school who was happy to say he liked Israel and he knew Bibi and all of that, and was trying to deal with shifting political circumstances.
He cowered when they came for him.
He cowered, right.
And by the way, Trump,
yes.
I think it's important to note that Trump,
right.
by contrast, sees these people when they are attacking him and says, go to hell.
Right, but
you idiot.
That's why I want to contrast this with Vance, because what Abe is saying is that Vance agrees with them. But as Christine says, is very careful. So he's not going to say he agrees with them, in part because Trump has now told them all to go to hell.
By the way, I don't know if his heart agrees with them.
I think, first of all, I don't know that he has a heart. I don't know that he has a conscience. I don't know that he has discernible views.
But I'm just saying.
Right.
Saying all I can say that I'm with confidence is that he wants them to think he agrees with them.
Right. Okay. But it's a distinction without a difference, in my view, because Theo Von said that Gaza was one of the sickest things that he has ever seen, and that Israel is cursed or something like that. So if he says his favorite is Theo Von and he has a good heart, he doesn't have a good heart and he shouldn't be his favorite. And in any conventional understanding of American politics, those views would have been disqualifying. They're not disqualifying anymore, which is a whole other subject. But he wants them to think he's dog whistling to them that he's on their side. And I hear the dog whistle, I'm not on their side and I can hear the dog whistle. So the difference is that Harris, and even Harris, who, again, not my idea of somebody I would want in charge of policy relating to how the United States should handle Israel, she was kowtowing to people who she disagreed with. And I don't think we have any reason to think that Vance disagrees with the podcast bros on Israel. Maybe they're violent, it's too violent, and their rhetoric is too extreme. But he's anti-war, they're anti-war. He thinks that we were dragged into this war. They think. And by the way, a lot of these views on Ukraine have some weird valence that is very hard to it's hard to line up. But the more ideologically enraged you are about support for Ukraine, the more aligned you are with anti-Zionist ideas. That just seems to be an almost one-to-one parallel. If you think that it is irresponsible, illegitimate, and bad that Ukraine is being supported by the West, you are also against this war and think that Israel was committing crimes in Gaza. And that is Vance. So I'm just saying, while Vance is careful, and Vance is this and Vance is that, Vance is, I think, setting himself up for potentially catastrophic failure. Because not that the American people aren't turning on Israel, because they clearly are, to some extent, by which I mean, asked a question, they say they don't like Israel as much as they used to. That doesn't mean they're going to vote on it. That doesn't mean that it's an issue that matters to them at all of that. But, and it's a very disheartening change. But fundamentally opposing American efforts to kick terrorist Muslim Islamist states out of and remove their power over us and over the world is something that the United States, I think the people of the United States still largely support 3-1, as opposed to Europe, where this is all very different. And Vance is still, and that was what was so weird about what he did last night, is still winking, dog whistling, waving, trying to get those people who are the leaders of this view in the United States to be his vanguard. And I think that's politically stupid. And I think we don't know how good Vance is as a politician, because his entire political career was getting himself the nomination in Ohio in 2022 through backdoor machinations with Trumpians, and getting himself the vice presidency in 2024 through backdoor machinations with Trumpians. And does he have a feel for the American people? Does he have a feel for how to get elected? Does he have a feel for mass approaches to? We don't know, but there's no reason to think that he does necessarily. And I think that this appeal to the radicals in the party first, maybe that's the right appeal, but the last time somebody really tried to do that, aside from Trump, if you want to use Trump as an example, which I don't think is the right example, was McGovern, who, got the Democratic Party on his side by going to the radical left inward and lost 49 states.
But here's the difference for Vance if he's strategic. And I hope he's not, because this is, if you care about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and globally, this is a bad sign. He has a huge amount of cover from the left for his own, if this is indeed what he's trying to do. So think about this Ezra Klein piece that was originally titled "Hassan Piker is Not the Enemy," an attempt to rehabilitate Piker's image after he has on numerous occasions been given an opportunity to back down from his more extremist views, his hateful views. He's never taken that opportunity. He's doubled down on all of it. And so Ezra Klein tries to kind of do what I think a lot of people on the left claim people on the right do, which is sane wash these views. People on the right are accused of sane washing Trump. They're doing this with Piker. And why does this matter? Not just because they then tweaked the headline of the piece so that it wasn't, a clear defense of Piker, which it was, but because that whole crowd shares the same views as the extremists, or many of the same views, particularly about Israel and about the Jews, as those on the right. And so if you're J.D. Vance, you can let a lot of the battle just, a lot of that cover, a lot of that normalizing of some of these extremist views happen, because it's happening through mainstream institutions like the New York Times, through NPR, through all of the places where, right of center voters aren't listening to these or consuming these, but a lot of people in the middle and the left of center are. So a lot of that work's being done for him by the left, and that's a difference between, I think, earlier eras where candidates went to their extreme at the beginning and then came back. He's gonna be on the same speaking terms with the radicals as on his right as on his left, and that really worries me for normalizing, moving that Overton window to a place that I don't think we've ever seen before with some of these views.
Eliana.
One funny point. Who would Vance have said young people should listen to 3 weeks ago? Tucker Carlson. Trump made it impossible for him.
And who would he have said they should listen to 5 years ago? Ben Shapiro.
Right.
That's how this conversation has gone, and where Vance has positioned himself. And I think he's made a mistake, and not just because Trump has lost his patience with the podcast bros. He has the same problem that Gillibrand and everybody Democrats had in 2019. He has overestimated the reach of the social media influencers. He has overestimated their effect. He has overestimated their ability to harness voters in his direction. And he is also on the wrong side of history in the sense that I think Trump is going to win this war, and he'll win this war. And though Vance will be associated with the victory because he's his vice president, it will also be known that he was against it from the start. So I don't know. I don't think that. I think there's reason to doubt Vance's, what we would say, political seichel here, and we should watch this space. Eliana, I just wanted to go to you because the Free Beacon in our annals of universities crashing and burning and destroying themselves, aside from the news that Hampshire College, one of the most hilariously, cluelessly leftist it was woke before the word woke even existed. I mean, in the 1970s, it was like already a place that even leftists giggled about attending because it was so ridiculous. That's how 50 years ago it was too leftist for, like, communists, is closing its doors. And that's it. Interesting it took this long, actually, but there it is. And an institution that will never close because it's a land-grant school, the University of North Carolina, you have a great story about what's going on there.
Sorry, I just realized I was on mute. I wanted to direct folks to, it's a long and detailed story about an absolute uproar.
At the Free Beacon.
At the Free Beacon, occurring at UNC, where two things: an April Fool's Day issue of the student newspaper, which is one of the best student newspapers in the country, the Daily Tar Heel, and a student-run late-night show, a skit aired on April Fool's Day, sent the campus into an absolute uproar because the satire touched on issues of race and class and immigration, and were subsequently denounced by the senior vice provost. Again, this is at a public school, of student life, one of the senior most officials at the school. So the spoof April Fool's Day issue ran an article, a joke article, about Trump replacing a state agency, the alcohol law enforcement agency, with ICE officials, and arresting a girl with a bad fake tan, a dark fake tan. And then the late night show called Hill After Hours had a very funny skit, a send up of a wealthy sorority girl going to some of the terrible housing on campus with a couple of bodyguards. And it's very, very funny if you go watch it. And these pieces of satire were summarily denounced by dozens of student groups, as well as university officials who pledged to investigate the content. And John, it occurred to me, the university's backed off a bit since Fire said it was going to open an investigation in this, and pointed out that North Carolina law requires university officials to stay neutral on contested political issues. But yesterday we were talking about the reemergence of Me Too. And we're often asked, have we reached peak woke? Is woke receding? And of course, I think it's true that we're not in the frenzy of 2020. But these things are still very much an issue. And I was saddened to see that both the editors of the student newspaper and the kids running this late night show issued groveling apologies. They're getting death threats, and pledged to institute DEI training, said they lack sensitivity. And these things are still very much issues playing out on college campuses, affecting kids. The adults are not in charge at many of these schools. So I urge people to go read it. It's a really interesting story written by a courageous senior at the University of North Carolina who reached out to the Free Beacon and wrote this in the face of all of her peers folding and apologizing for what they did.
Okay, the problem is you said that the adults are not in charge. Sadly, the adults are in charge because the adults are the bad guys here. Kids aren't the bad guys. The adults are the bad guys.
Absolutely.
The adults could say, you're upset about a skit? Get over it. Thanks very much. See you next year. Don't jeopardize your scholarship by making trouble on campus.
What struck me is that these satires actually have a left-wing bent. They're mocking ICE, and they are mocking the wealthy white sorority girl and her lack of, culture. And the students couldn't even, stand for that. They flew into a rage over those things. And then the statements were that the provost statements were that immigration, race, and class should not be satirized. What are we supposed to make fun of?
It's the end of comedy.
What are we supposed to make fun of?
I'm sorry, but again, who the hell's business is it of the provost to say that something should or should not be satirized? This is a public land grant school that is under the aegis and authority of the First Amendment of the United States. It is not a private institution. Private institutions are not, because of the nature of the contract between the student or the student's parents and the school, outweigh the First Amendment. You do not necessarily have First Amendment rights at a private institution. I mean, you have First Amendment rights as a citizen of the United States, but the school is allowed to police your behavior. That is part of the private contract. That is not true of public institutions. It is not true. The provost has no right to say you shouldn't do X. The provost should shut his stinking trap. Or
there's another problem with the provost, which is supposed to be grateful that Gen Z, who many of us worried were going to be permanently lobotomized by staring at their smartphones forever. Satire is a sign of intellectual health in a culture. And for these students to actually take it upon themselves to do the kind of satire that even, say, some of our own national sketch comedy shows would dare not do is a very healthy thing that should be encouraged. We should see more of this. It was so heartening reading the story to see that kids are still invested in mocking the institutions in society that deserve to be mocked sometimes. That's the sign of health.
And let's play whataboutism. What if that sketch were about, Gaza and Jews and AIPAC and an effort to suppress Ilhan Omar? You think the provost would come in and say you're not allowed to satirize stuff like that? Of course the provost wouldn't come in and say anything like that. It's all about whose ox is being gored. That's why the adults are bad. The adults are the villains. We're hearing that it's students who had cows. Students can have cows about anything. They're upset if the team loses. Fine. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Official proceedings aren't entered into by students. This is a state school that is paid for by the taxpayers of the state of North Carolina. I mean, that's the story that operates under a charter from the state of North Carolina. It's not run for the benefit, the students' views on whether or not they're offended You know what they can do is stage a counter comedy show, making fun of the comedy show. You know, that's how you're supposed to do it. It's like the outrage is, and I think, Elia, the point of the piece is very important, which is that the outrage is that they're not stopping, that they're not getting the message that their era is over. They are going to cling to the power that they arrogated to themselves to police speech, thought, and politics until it is wrested from their hands in every single way that it can be wrested from their hands.
And they are following
not
the
let
lead
go.
of outraged students because they themselves are, they're in charge, but they're following the lead of children rather
and how
than
do we know? And how do we know the
instructing-
children
Right.
are even the inceptors? Like, how do we know it's not that?
Well-
how do we know it's not that a kid went to class the next day and a professor wasn't screaming about how evil the April Fool's Day story was in the joke paper?
That's true. However,
I'm just saying.
23
Yeah.
student groups issued statements denouncing this. So, sure, it's possible that every professor on campus was outraged, but I do think a lot of this comes from kids who were all on social media
Yeah.
up in
And
arms
I
over
should
this
point
stuff.
out, I just looked this up. There are 33,000 students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So even if 23 student groups representing 500 people at most, let's say, because a lot of student groups have 6 people in them, right? That still is that, I mean, I don't even know what percentage that is. It's 2% of the student body out of 98% of the student body that didn't protest. Does that never matter? No, because the protest was used by to enhance the power of the administrators to control the speech and thoughts of the students whom the Constitution does not allow them to control.
And of other student groups on campus. The president of the student body denounced this. His successor denounced this. So there are student groups dueling against each other for who controls, the narrative power on campus.
So depressing. Okay, well, we've achieved crushing morosity yet again. Our old slogan coming back into the fore. Please excuse me if I said anything offensive to our
Getting us that
Catholic
explicit
listeners.
rating again today, John. I tell you.
I know. And please excuse me if my effort to discuss incredibly complex matters in an unbelievably limited, shallow, and just to reignite our explicit label, bullshitty, hour of conversation in the morning. If I elided and made vulgarities out of unbelievably important 2 millennia old traditions, and just understand that we talk 6 hours a week here, and sometimes maybe we go too far. Anyway, till tomorrow and a big surprise tomorrow. Big surprise. We have a returning champion returning for what might be a weekly gig back on the podcast. Matthew Continetti will be here tomorrow. So tune in.
Talk about a tease.
For Abe, Eliana, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.